biff quickela yearwan, coof on feela, black on bertelich, beoþ oftask, fairly aflingas, inner restaf. Wesaþ hale, eachem heolaches, meom margothen habe each merfla fela, ungunen on yeogotha, me wed glendless thing, on minla effelterf underna kuf, seja selethend thapta celestanda, relechet celesta, linka ye wilchum, Edel on unit sifen effen leot, unde heofnes, hedor be Holland Wesaþ. Thus were the first words spoken by Beowulf, Prince of the Geats, when he first entered Herlot to speak with King Hrothgar. Wilcuman to my Mead Hall, Meadowseld. Now, Beowulf, though fictional, is probably the best known of the Anglo-Saxon princes. And in today's episode of Wyrdwayz, I want to speak to you about the Anglo-Saxon rune Cēnnan. Now, Cēnnan is an interesting poem that speaks of the torch of fire. Cēnnan biff quickela yearwan, coof on fearla, black on bertelich, beoþ oftask, fairly aflingas, inner restaf. And now, in English, modern English, the torch is known to every living man by its pale, bright flame. It always burns where princes sit within. So in today's episode I want to talk to you about all sorts of interesting things. The Mead Hall, the Meadowseld, the Dlichtensel, sometimes also the Hof. How it was used in Anglo-Saxon society, why it was used in that way. Also about fire, Anglo-Saxon princes, and maybe a few other interesting things as well. So, this is Wyrdwayz, and this is the rune Cēnnan. Ayla. So I'm out of the Mead Hall and in a decidedly very chilly wood in the southwest of England. It is cold today, so I'll try not to ramble too much. So wilcuman, I'd just like to say thank you to all my subscribers. It really does mean the world to me to see my subscription numbers going up and to know that people are enjoying this content, so thank you. If you haven't already subscribed, I'd be really grateful for a subscription to this channel. Thank you. Thank you, Thay. I'm also on Instagram as Wyrdwayz, so you can check me out there. And also Facebook, Wyrdwayz, the world of Anglo-Saxon runes. I have a Patreon account if anybody wants to support my work that way. That would be wunderlich. Anyway, without much ado, let's get on and talk about the Anglo-Saxon rune Cain. Now, if you're familiar with this rune in the Elder Futhark or Uthark, then it has a completely different shape to the shape of the rune in the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, which is unique to these Old English runes. So this is how the rune normally looks within the Elder Futhark, and this is how the Anglo-Saxon version of this rune looks. You can see it's quite different. It's actually quite similar to how it appears in the younger Futhark, which is like this. But yes, the shape is quite unique to the Old English runes. So this is obviously has the sound k, the sharp C or the K sound. Now I've already read to you back in the Mead Hall the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. So I'm going to read to you now the Icelandic and the Norwegian versions of this poem. We'll start with the Icelandic. Now in the Icelandic it's known as caun, which means ulcer. Ulcer, disease, fatal to children, and painful spot, an abode of mortification. So that's not very cheery, is it? The Norwegian one is no better. Ulcer is fatal to children, death makes a corpse pale. So the Anglo-Saxon rune poem is in fact the only one that talks about fire and the torch and a somewhat cheerier subject than dead children presented to us from the Norwegians and the Icelandic people. So if we look up the word Cain within an Anglo-Saxon dictionary, then the definition that we get is pine, torch, pine, a torch. Now this makes sense because the torches that the Anglo-Saxons used within their mead halls would have been powered and fueled by turpentine, which is made from the resin of pine trees. So that all makes sense. Now the first thing I'd like you to do is think about the importance of fire to our Anglo-Saxon ancestors. In fact, not just our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, but to human beings in general. Man has a very primal connection with fire, a connection that goes back as far as humanity has ever existed. Now some scientists actually believe that it was the ability to cook food, to use fire and cook food, that allowed the human brain to grow and for us to develop into the species that we have done today. So fire has an awful lot to answer for when you think about it, doesn't it? I've got a friend who followed a raw food diet for a while, and she told me that it was really difficult for her to maintain weight, and that whilst on this diet she lost a lot of weight. I'm not knocking the raw food diet, I don't fancy it myself, but I believe it is quite difficult to maintain weight when on a raw food diet. There is something about the cooking of the food that helps us humans to get what we need from food. So now I want you to use your imagination. It's not that difficult for me because I am absolutely flipping freezing, but I want you to imagine what life in a cold, drafty, damp wooden hut on a cold, rainy winter's day in early medieval England might be like. Cold, damp and miserable. Now I want you to imagine that we introduce a controlled fire. All of a sudden that space is transformed. What a difference that fire makes. So fire transforms. It transforms feelings. It turns coldness and misery into warmth and comfort and joy. It turns darkness into light. It illuminates a space. It transforms fear to safety. It transforms raw food into a tasty, nutritious meal. And of course, on a physical level, it transforms flammable matter to ash. So fire is a transformer. Of course, if that fire is allowed to become out of control, then we have a very different situation. If you've ever been with a fire that suddenly got out of control, then you will know that very primal fear that grips you, because fire can destroy. It can destroy quickly. It can tear through anything and destroy it. So we are talking specifically in this rune poem about a controlled fire, a fire which is controlled by man for a purpose. So the torch is known to every living man by its pale, bright flame. It always burns where princes sit within. Now, if we take this rune poem on face value, then it doesn't really give us an awful lot. But then, as we know, things are not always as they seem. So let's look at some of the language which has been used. Now, the word black on beoþ, if we look it up in an Anglo-Saxon dictionary, we'll see that it actually has two main meanings that are quite contradictory. One meaning is bright, shining, glittering, flashing, okay? And it also has the meaning of pale, pallid and wan, like John Barleycorn in the song, like I was the other week when I was ill. I lost all my colour. But with this rune poem, with the torch, we are most probably talking about the kind of bright, glittering meaning. So I love to use my imagination and imagine what it might be like to be in a Mead Hall with the firelight dancing and glittering off the jewels and catching on the metalwork and the murals on the wall. Oh, I really want my own Mead Hall one day. So this contradiction in meanings. Now, as we know, the Anglo-Saxons, they loved their double entendres. I mean, they loved their riddles. So now I want to take you to one of their riddles, which is in the Exeter Book of Riddles. It's riddle 50. I'm going to read it to you in modern English first. A warrior is wondrously brought forth on earth, for the profit of people a bright thing produced. From two speechless ones, one which marshals in anger, foe against his foe. A woman often binds him, the very strong one. He obeys them well, peaceably serves them, if women and men minister him in a fitting manner. Feed him fairly, he furnishes them with benefits, with the delights of life. Grimly he repays those that let him become proud. So do you know what the usual answer to this riddle is? Well, you've probably guessed, as this episode is about the torch, that this is fire. Now I'm going to read it to you in Old English. Wigger is on earthen, wundlum acaned, delictum tunita of dumbum twam, torta tuted, thonna on teon wigef, feond his feonde, for strange oft, weef hinerlif, hey him well hearlef. They waff him thewale, yeef him thaniaf, maef on marges, midgemeterlicta. They daf hina file, hey him flemem stepef, liefer on lissum, lienef glima, tham fahina wolonka, weothn latef. So that was the Old English of riddle 50. Now this is one of only 13 riddles from the Exeter Book of Riddles where the interaction between the inanimate object and the user is depicted as a relationship between a lord and a servant, or a thane. Now this one is slightly different because technically fire is not an inanimate object, it is an element. But the premise is the same. Now in her dissertation, Jennifer Neville calls this the implement trope. Now as we know, Anglo-Saxon society was highly hierarchical. There were clearly defined roles and positions, ranks within society that were adhered to, understood and accepted. If you were one of the poor, lower class people, then your life was fairly miserable. It was a life of work and of subservience to those elite people in power. Now this was established, this was a social norm. There are several of these implement trope riddles within the Exeter Book of Riddles, which all serve to reinforce this ideology. An ideology clearly created and maintained by those in power. Now Riddle 50 is interesting, as many of them are, because what it does is it dares to voice the unthinkable, the unquestionable, the socially ridiculous. It certainly does voice, albeit heavily clad in riddle form, that which wouldn't have dared to be uttered within Anglo-Saxon society, you know, with its very highly, rigidly hierarchical and, let's face it, kind of sexist structures. So in Riddle 50 we hear how a warrior, one of the elite ruling people, was bound by a woman. A woman often binds him, the very strong one. He obeys them well. So this is interesting, and we'll talk later about, you know, more about the hierarchical ideology later. But there is one meaning that this could be, which isn't related to a hierarchical system at all, but love. If somebody is in love, then they can be bound to that person. And of course, in modern day, there are very strong connections between fire and love and passion. And I see no reason why that these couldn't have been in place in Anglo-Saxon times. They did like their multiple meanings. Now, it's so cold. If you pick up a modern rune book and you look up the Germanic equivalent Cēnnars, then chances are you're going to find meanings of creativity and knowledge. Now, what I want to look at now is this just New Age gumph, or can we find any connections within the Anglo-Saxon rune poems to substantiate these meanings? There's certainly no hints of either of these qualities within the dead children poems of the Norwegian and the Icelandic. So can we find anything within the Anglo-Saxon? So let's begin with creativity, shall we? It's a good place to begin. Now, fire in a controlled state, which is what this rune poem is about, can be used to create and craft and smith beautiful objects, beautiful pieces of jewellery. And of course, we know from the archaeological finds that the Anglo-Saxons were master craftsmen. They created amazingly beautiful and intricate jewellery. If we look at the Anglo-Saxon language, we can find a very similar word to Cain, which is Cēnnan, which means to beget, conceive, create, or bring forth. So yes, what we can say is this word, which is clearly related to Cain, is indeed related to creativity. So that's interesting. Now, when I run my shamanic art workshops, I often get people to chant this rune as Galda towards the beginning of the course, and I have to say it is very effective and it can help with creativity. So I said that within a modern rune book you may also find the meaning of knowledge for this rune. Can we find any connections with this in the Anglo-Saxon language? Well, no, we can't. Nothing can be found in Old English. Now, in Old Norse there is the word Kenna, which means to know or perceive, so that clearly is related, but it's quite different in Old English. In Old English, the verbs understanden, the verb means to perceive, whereas the verb witan means to know. But this is interesting. There's another very similar word to Cain that we find in the language of the Anglo-Saxons, which is Kenna. Now, here again, just like the word black, we find multiple meanings. Now, one meaning of this word, Kenna, is fierce, keen, bold, brave, and warlike. Now another is learned and clever and in warlike wise. Now this is interesting. Now all of these qualities that I've just listed, which do include learned, implying the acquisition of knowledge, could very easily be applied to a prince. And as we know from the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, the prince sits within. Now a prince, or Æðelings as they were known, would have had to have possessed all of these qualities in order to have maintained his elite position within society. He would have had to have been fierce, bold, warlike, brave, a strong leader. And it would, of course, have been the elite within society that would have had access to knowledge and learning. So all of this leads me very nicely onto what I want to talk about next, which is about the Anglo-Saxon long hall, the meadow cell or beoþ, also known as the drillicht cell, the princely hall. Now we can find several words within the Anglo-Saxon language which mean prince. There's bregu, there's Landfruma, Æðeling, of course, which can be spelt a couple of different ways, and Landfruma. Now I also found, when I was poking through some Anglo-Saxon literature, the word Theoden used, which in that circumstance translated as prince. Now it can also be translated as king or as leader, ruler. And of course you're probably thinking of Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien used that word as the name of one of the kings. So I'm going to finish this half of the episode here because I've talked for long enough and it's so cold. And in part 2 I'm going to talk a lot more about the meadow cell, the beoþ, the hall, the princely hall, and some of its uses and how it was used within the hierarchical ideology that I spoke about earlier. So thank you ever so much for joining me in this absolutely freezing cold wood in the southwest of England. I need a Mead Hall. So thank you again to also my subscribers. If you like this video, please subscribe, please give it a like, and join me in part 2 where I shall finish talking about the Anglo-Saxon rune Cain. So for now, Ayla, and I will see you again soon.